Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we are diving into the life and career of Sister Rosetta Tharpe, so stick around. Ladies and gentlemen, this episode of the show is brought to you by the Marysville Barber Parlor at 414 4th Street in Marysville. I am an absolute snob when it comes to my barbershop experience. I like to walk in. I like there to be cool stuff on the walls, cool vibes, good conversation, usually a free beer in the fridge, and they don't charge you an arm and a leg, and they do a killer job. So it is my kind of spot. I love hanging out in there. And for a limited time, if you walk into the Marysville Barber Parlor and tell them that George Croft's Music Show sent you, you will get $10 off your first haircut. So go get yourself $10 off a killer haircut with our friends down at the Marysville Barber Parlor. Thanks for watching the show. All right, so Sister Rosetta Tharpe is another one of my favorite kinds of characters where you can clearly see that she had a massive impact on the way that American music would develop, but not a lot of people have heard her name anymore. 15. So she's one of the early blues artists here. So she's born in 1915 as Rosie Atkins, and she was born in Cotton Plant, Arkansas. And she pretty quickly, I think at age 6, she starts performing in churches, and she's very tied into the kind of the black church community of the South at the time, and which happened for a lot of people. But where she immediately starts to stand out, first of all, is her vocal quality. She's recognized very early on as just a vocal talent that stands out above everybody else. And but really where she starts to kind of stand out in my mind is she picks up the electric guitar and is wickedly talented. I mean, she's out there, you watch these old videos of her just shredding away while she's singing, and she's like this sweet, like church lady, but she's just killing it on electric guitar playing gospel songs. And if you watch videos of her and then you watch people like Chuck Berry and Little Richard and these other guys, they all credit her with starting that style. So and Jerry Lee Lewis too, like all of these early rock stars would point at Sister Rosetta as an early inspiration. And she's kind of like, at least as far as I can tell, she's the pioneer of that style. I don't know who else is playing the electric guitar, for the blues like that at the time. And I mean, there are others, that she's learning from, but she's got her own distinct style, and that style would, bleed into these future rock star artists. And it's just incredible. Like like I said, a real pioneer, and just doing her own thing from the jump. And she starts out singing, like I said, she's in church, so it's all hymnals and gospel music, but she starts to kind of put her own flair into it, which is where she starts to really, get noticed here. And so she's touring around, she's playing shows, I think she started out, her family moved to Chicago, I think in 1921 when she was 6. So that's kind of where she starts getting her roots going. And, but all through the 20s, she's touring around with her family, going to different churches and doing revivals and things like that. And in 1934, when she's 19 years old, she gets married for the first time. And unsurprisingly, she gets married to a preacher. And his name was Thomas Thorpe, Thorp, which she like stylizes into Tharpe. Like that's where her stage name comes from, is this first marriage to Thomas Thorpe. And that first marriage is pretty, like, it's the same thing that we keep running into with all these female artists, that like they marry a guy who thinks he's going to be able to assert himself on their career or their style, and it just does not go well. It immediate source of friction. Add that on to the complex character that Rosetta Tharpe was. I mean, I think it was going to be a rough go. And but anyway, so she makes that first marriage when she's 19, and that's in 1934. And in 1938, as her career is progressing here, she signs with Decca Records, and she releases a song called Rock Me. Now, that song is a gospel song, but when you sing it the way that Rosetta sings it, it's got an edge to it that accomplished a couple of things. First of all, it bleeds the boundary of this gospel music towards kind of the rock and roll bluesy music that people are wanting to hear. And so while it simultaneously opens it up to not just the Christian audience, it opens it up to the wider music audience, it also does a pretty good job of pissing off the Christian crowd. Like they're telling, like she's, dirtying up the Lord's music kind of thing, which she doesn't let that feedback slow her down at all. I mean, she immediately that's her thing. And something that tends to pop up, especially for her, but in other artists too, female artists at the time, is, their consistency with, like, they just seem to have this North Star of the thing that they want to go do. And wherever they get resistance, they kind of just plow over it. So in this case, where the Christian community is like, oh, you're dirtying up the Lord's music, she's all right, man, like, listen to it if you want, don't if you don't. And she just keeps on keeping on. But that does kind of push her to that kind of other side of the music industry at the time. Like, she kind of gets away a little bit from the gospel crowd, and she's playing bigger shows. She's playing to wider audiences and not just in churches. Like, and she plays some pretty hard places throughout this time. Like, this is in here is where she starts performing, everyone, like, not exclusively, but she's performing on the Chitlin circuit, which we talked about in our Little Richard episode, which the Chitlin circuit was this pretty wild scene in the South, for black artists, and, where there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. They had like drag shows, and it was very like sexuality boundaries were blurred, if existent at all. And there was just, it was kind of a wild, seedy scene. But Sister Rosetta would show up and play these shows, bringing her like rockin' style of gospel music, and people loved it all over the place. But like I said, that wasn't exclusively what she was doing, but she had no fear about performing at venues like that. And so, she's kind of establishing herself as like a go-to artist for that community. And right before, kind of in the early 40s here, is when she finds Little Richard. Now, we had, this is where we bumped into the story before in our Little Richard episode, because I think in the early 40s, she was singing at a church, and she hears this kid singing. I think he was either as part of the choir or as an earlier act singing. And she immediately recognizes his talent and like picks him up right there and is like, hey, I'm going to pay you as my opener. You want to come up here and sing? And she brings Little Richard out on stage and that's his first paid opening gig, that he gets, which had a huge impact on Little Richard, like we talked about in his episode. But so that comes at the time where she's sort of branching out. She's become this kind of, legendary figure already. Everybody knows who she is in that community. And I think she kind of paved the way for Little Richard in a big way, especially with some of the venues that he was playing later and kind of the way his career was able to progress. I think Sister Rosetta Tharpe really kind of plowed that trail, for Little Richard to follow. And then, like I said, stylistically, she was just inspiring as hell. So, but that happens here in the early 40s. And she's also, during this time, some of these places she's playing, she's another one of these characters that just loves the music and isn't worried about the race side of this whole thing. Like lots of people were, obviously, but she would just spot acts that she liked, and it didn't matter what race they were. She'd, bring them up with her. And so she does this to the Jordanaires, who tell funny stories now about like, it's kind of like this other side of the racism coin where like, like Chuck Berry and all these guys tell stories about showing up to venues that didn't realize that they were black. They show up and then they're not allowed to go on because it's like a whites only venue or whatever. And so simultaneously, the Jordanaires are showing up to black clubs, and the And Rosetta didn't tell the club owners that her opening or her supporting act was a white quartet. Like, she just said, yeah, the Jordanaires are coming with me. And so when the black club owners open the door and it's these 4 suit wearing white dudes, they're like, all right, well, the audience is like gonna be surprised by this, but come on in. So, but it was kind of like there was a not equal by any chance, but a similar shock value to this, like, playing to a black audience and this group of white guys comes out singing with Sister Rosetta, which I thought was just a cool kind of reflection in the society. And it was funny because Sister Rosetta would call them her I think she called them her 4 white babies or something like there's, which they, was an endearing term. And yeah, it just kind of shows you the other side of the coin. It wasn't like, as clear cut back then as you might imagine. But anyway, so the Jordanaires are doing, going through doing their thing, and there's some great performances that you can still find on YouTube with all of them. And but anyway, so this is where the story takes a little bit of a detour here, because I discovered something doing research for this podcast that I wasn't aware of. So obviously, early 40s, World War II is cracking off. And one of the unintended or unforeseen, consequences here, and a bunch of other moving parts are happening at the same time. So Japan starts doing its thing, invading Southeast Asia. And they're doing that for a bunch of reasons. Japan is a small island and they're strapped for resources, right? So they start moving in on their neighbors, including, most of Southeast Asia, which they did in part to target oil production, rubber production, and other things that the U.S. had access to that were big parts of our warfighting machine. So, part of the motivation for Japan invading those places was to restrict our access to those resources. One of the other resources that happens to be there is shellac, which is, I think it's the lac beetle that, makes this resin that we use for all kinds of stuff, especially back then. Shellac was, used in tons of products. Most notably for this story, it was used in to make records. The records used to be made out of shellac before they were made out of vinyl. And that material, so basically, as World War II cracks off, the music industry gets squeezed from a couple different angles, one of which being shellac gets restricted. And the other thing that we use shellac for, or at least at the time, the military uses it for, is a component in explosives and gunpowder and things like that, and like other defense industry things. And so I think 30% of America's shellac input at that time was getting used for records. So because we're at war, we can't just be throwing away 30% of our shellac that we need to build bombs and bullets. We got to use that for the military, and the place that we get it from just shut it off. So we have a huge shellac problem in, 1940 or 1941 to 45. So the other thing that's squeezing the music industry at the same time, you got to imagine this is the early record days, like we've talked about before with Jimmy Rogers and all these guys. The technology itself is really young. And one of the issues of running it, so the industry standard at the time was shellac records, but that material has some limitations. Like, first of all, it's very brittle. It's like it breaks like glass almost. Like it's hard to pack. It has, like shipping wise, it's very difficult. Like records would show up places broken all the time just by getting bumped in the truck or whatever. And the material also doesn't lend itself to very tight grooves. So you couldn't pack as many songs on one side of a 12-inch disc. So that's happening. And then at the same time that we're having the shellac problem, the music industry in America starts going through a bunch of strikes because they were going through kind of similar to what we're going through now, where it's like AI is really blurring the lines on who owns what and where things came from or whatever. that same kind of a painful shift is happening in America, but it's about live performances to recorded performances where like suddenly you can just listen to your favorite song over and over and over. You don't have to pay that artist to show up and put on a show. You just move the needle and play it again. And so the machinery that allowed artists to get paid royalties for records and stuff was very new, and there was some dirty baseball getting played initially. So part of solving that problem is giant strikes that go on, in the music industry about getting artists the royalties that they deserve from radio stations and, record sales and that sort of thing. So the music industry kind of grinds to a halt for a second there. And, it becomes very difficult to just crank out new material. Like I said, not least of which because even if the strikes hadn't been happening, the shellac shortage basically ended production there. So those two things happening at the same time, the military decides that getting records out to the boys on the front is a good morale boost, and they are correct about that. And they decided to solve that problem through this thing they called V-discs. Now, V-discs were basically, the military said, okay, we are going to produce recordings with artists that we pay, but instead of royalties, because that was the squeeze at the time, was like, what do we do about royalties? So the Army said, and the Navy separately also did this. They said, okay, we're going to pay the artists to make the recordings. We're not going to pay them royalties, but it's with the understanding that these are to be distributed to troops and not for resale. Like you can't buy these in any storefront. We're just going to make records to send out to the troops. And they also, in the same breath, said, and we're going to do this on this new material called vinylite. Now, vinylite is an early predecessor to vinyl. It's another PVC plastic. And RCA Victor had already started making some records out of vinyl. Like it was an early kind of, the machinery already existed, the technology already existed. It just wasn't super popular yet because the shellac records were the standard and they were easy to make. And it was, the machinery was all already there. Well, when the military comes in and says, hey, look, our boys need some music out here, we're going to send them your music and we're going to put it on vinyl. It basically launches the vinyl industry, which became the new standard. That's where you get vinyl records from now. So it's not that the military invented the technology, but they boosted it hard and kind of gave it the legs that it needed to become the standard as quickly as it did. So it solved the shellac problem, and it solved all the other, not just the problem with supply, it solved all the other things that people didn't like about shellac. It was, that vinyl is way tougher. You can flex it. It doesn't shatter, if the truck goes over a bad bump. Grooves can be packed way closer together, so you get way more playtime of music per, square inch. And it held up better over time. So the same record would last, hundreds or thousands of times through, instead of shellac that wore out much faster. So it was kind of a tidal wave of things going that way, where it was a better material, more readily available, held up, way better under stress. And then the Army's desire to bring music to the troops gave them the, motivation to go around this strike that was happening, kind of stopping the music industry in the early 40s. Well, one of the artists, I think they made something like 8 million records or something, or maybe it wasn't that many, but anyway, a absolute ton of records got shipped off to the front. And one of the artists that signed up to do that was Sister Rosetta Tharpe. So kind of a tangent, but here we are back to Sister Rosetta. So she, and I think a bunch of other names that you recognize also did this at the time. Like Bing Crosby was a big one, and there are a couple others. Sister Rosetta was one of the few Black artists that was part of that crowd. And so she became kind of this, through line where all the Black American soldiers really just clung on to her music because it was, something they were familiar with. It was just great, wildly talented, music coming out. And so she became, like I said, this kind of rock figure for the troops on the front line during World War II because she was part of that V-disc push, which I thought was really cool. It's kind of, and how that bleeds into now, like how World War II, just a random beetle that happens to be in Southwest Asia was in the way when Japan invaded, and that pushed us to using vinyl, which I thought was a cool little side trope here. But anyway, so Sister Rosetta carries on after World War II, and she does something else here that, like I said, she, being this kind of free-spirited lady who was very hard to tell what to do, she was also pretty open about her sexuality. So there was a lot of like men, women, she's sleeping around on husbands and girlfriends and the whole thing. Like, she did not care. And so that ends her first marriage, which and she remarries. So she divorces Thomas Thorpe and almost immediately remarries her manager, which is a guy named Folk Allen. And because he was her manager, their personal and business affairs get intertwined almost immediately, and it becomes kind of a rat nest to deal with, because he's pushing her very hard to, on the career front, but he's also her husband, so the decision-making power gets a little bit out of whack here, and it causes friction pretty quick here. But as this is happening, her career is just skyrocketing. Like, she's playing bigger and bigger and bigger shows. I think in 1945, she headlined like a gospel revival thing at Griffith Stadium, and I think that was like 25,000 people or something, which is nuts for 1945. And then soon thereafter, she plays a show at the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, which, shout out to the Ryman. We love those guys. They're still operating today. And at this show at the Ryman, I think she was, what was the other artist? It was not just Sister Rosetta. There were other gospel artists there. It was it's escaping me in my notes, but Mahalia Jackson, I think is how you say that, was the headliner, and Sister Rosetta was part of the lineup. And while she's there, she spots another young artist named Marie Knight. There at the Ryman, her and Marie Knight have, they meet, they have some kind of interaction. 2 weeks later, Sister Rosetta shows up at Marie Knight's house and basically says, like, you got to come on the road with me. Like, you're going to be a star. Come on the road. And at the same time, they also develop a romantic relationship, which, like I said, causes some issues. And so in 1947, a year later, she ends up divorcing Folk Allen. And this is a weird time because no contest divorces back then were pretty hard to get unless you were in Nevada, which is why she did it there. But this wasn't like a clean, yep, we're just getting divorced, the business is its own thing. Because they were so tied in, Sister Rosetta has to like basically testify against her husband in divorce proceedings that were public. She has to face down this, and like I said, at the time, this is 1947. Divorce is not like a shoulder shrug thing. It's a very big deal. And this is her second one she's going through. And now she has to take the stand against her husband and explain why he should be separated from her in the marriage, but also the business. And she has to like lay out her case for, being able to continue her career basically, which is nuts. So she goes through this very painful and awkward, it's not a trial, but it's like a divorce proceeding that was very public. And so, and her career, continues on here, but she does, so in 1948, she releases a duet called Above My Head with the Sam Price Trio. And that's like some pretty serious chart success. I think it hits number 6 on what they called the race chart at the time. And she buys a house in Richmond, Virginia. Now, that's followed up that's 1948, followed up in 1951, where she releases a song called "Didn't It Rain," and that's her first kind of signature real hit. Like, this is, like I said, her career is full steam ahead here. She does start to run into financial trouble despite her recording success here at the time in the early 50s. But yeah, so at the same time, her and Marie Knight are touring around together. Like, that little side quest is continuing. And this is also where, so this is, in the late 1950s, I think I might have put this before in the timeline, but it's during this time that she meets Little Richard and brings him up on stage. Anyway, so her career keeps going full steam ahead. She starts touring in Europe. She's doing all kinds of stuff. And this is where you get great footage of her performing for British audiences and talking about, oh, I love my British fans and everything. But you see this, the crowd that would become the Beatles fans, a few years later, are all about Sister Rosetta, in London or whatever. And she goes all over Europe. I think she goes to Copenhagen and all kinds of other places, like Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Scandinavia. She goes all over the place. But let's see here. But anyway, so somewhere in there, she runs into more financial trouble, and she ends up losing that house in Virginia, which obviously was a fortunate circumstance. But this is where she uses that European touring to kind of build back from that. So she just keeps on doing her own thing. She just, I don't think she ever remarries after she gets that last divorce in Nevada. And she continues just being this kind of legendary figure around the music scene. And then in the, let's see here, 1960, she settles down in Philadelphia. Well, she does get remarried again to Russell Morrison. That's right. Jeez, I forgot. My notes weren't in front of me. But then in 1971, this is where things kind of take a turn here, because one of her friends, who I can't remember what the name was, remember seeing a black spot on Rosetta's foot and asking her, what's going on with that? And Rosetta kind of being like, oh, I don't know. And then that spot grows and grows and grows and grows until her friends convince her to go to the doctor. Now, that turns out to have been complications from diabetes. And it gets bad enough that she gets her leg amputated, which is a huge problem, obviously. And that, it's not the death blow to her career, but it's a huge slowdown. But she, eventually, I think 1972, she comes back, and does another couple of shows here, and with Marie Knight too, and singing like nothing was wrong. And they, people talk about how those shows were, they sang together like they always had, and it was, put on a great show. Yeah, I think she had a stroke that slowed her down a little bit, but she was able to continue. But then she has the diabetes thing in 71, gets her leg amputated, and then in 73 she has another stroke, and that kills her. So she died at age 58. And which, again, just these, short lives for some of the greats here. And then in 2018, she is posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and kind of gets some of the credit that she deserves. But that's, decades later. But yeah, like I said, she was kind of this figure that just kind of kept on her own track. And, she didn't let anybody put her in a box. She didn't let anybody tell her what to do. She just kind of plowed ahead, did her own thing, and played great music, and brought up other artists along the way, and inspired the next wave of rock and roll artists. Like the Beatles cite her as a, inspiration. Obviously Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, all these people, the Rolling Stones, like everybody that the rest of the world came to love will cite Sister Rosetta as an early inspiration. So she was a real, player when it came to pushing American music forward and across the world. Because like I said, she was touring all over the place, bringing that sound to the world and inspiring people everywhere. So yeah, just a cool story. And yeah, I had never heard of the shellac thing before I did the research for this episode. That was a cool cool little side piece. Like, you never know how global events shape, things like music that you would think are separate from that. But nope, that's how we got vinyl records. So that is Sister Rosetta Tharpe, which is hard to say 10 times fast. So thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you next week.